We heard that there may or may not have been a meeting at the beginning of this year where you decided to improve coverage of climate change, to move it from being an environmental beat to really something new and different. And that the Globe as an institution, as we just heard from Brian, is very committed to this. And this is new in a way. So I wanted to know if all of you could talk about that a little bit, and maybe starting with you, Steve.
Yes, we had a big meeting. I think it felt to all of us that obviously climate change has been covered a lot. There have been a lot of climate change stories. I don't know that they're all terribly well read. And my own personal feeling, I feel like there was a very personal element to my journey in this particular story. I came to it having read lots of stories or seen lots of stories or being aware of them, but a lot of them felt remote, far away in the future somehow.
Polar bears somewhere.
Polar bears, yeah, and all of them are moving and anxiety-provoking, but they left me with a feeling of powerlessness, and I ended up, they were easy to set aside and go back to my regular life without ever doing something like that. And this felt like the year to try to tackle some way to bring climate change home. It happened that in the spring of 2018, we did a somewhat short story about a clam shack, we'll hear more about that in a few minutes, that was effectively destroyed by a major nor'easter that clawed out 80 feet of beach. And it was dramatic and a little terrifying. That actually set the germ of an idea in motion. We started thinking about, well, what if we went to Cape Cod? And I don't think it was a fully formed idea at that point, but as Brian McGrory encouraged us to think more deeply about it, it came to me that this was our way to make a story that was not remote or abstract, but that was intimate and real and tangible and part of all of our lives. It happens that I spent a good part of the last couple of decades going to Cape Cod pretty much every summer. Rented a house with some friends. I had just powerful, nostalgic memories of that. And that was the thing that got it for me, is that this is a force that is not only changing the coastline, but the fabric of the place itself. And so we really formed our notion of the story around that idea.
That's so great. Nestor, maybe you're next, and then John, I'd love to hear.
As Brian indicated when he introduced us, when he brought this story to me, I was maybe even a little reluctant for some of the reasons Steve laid out. Climate change stories are critically important, of course. This communicating this stuff is really, really critical. Often it's not particularly well read. Often it's hard to do it in a way that has a real sort of measurable impact. But the great thing about this idea is that so many people here and around the region and around the world really connect with the Cape, right? You could bring it home in a way that that people can feel and people can taste and smell. And so the second part of that was focusing not just on a very particular location, but on a very particular moment, right? So many of these stories, in really important ways, look at the terrifying future, right? What's going to happen in 2100 when seas have risen by 1 meter or more? Well, rather than go that route, we decided to focus really intently on what you can see now, what you can measure now, what the people who live and work there, like some of the folks you're going to hear from later, know is happening and how they know it. The other thing we didn't do is engage in some argument about whether this is real, right? It is real. So once you make it an argument, you've sort of lost. So one of the first things Brian and I talked about, and the first thing Steve and I talked about, was not to even entertain that. And once we had landed on those notions, I was pretty sold on this as something worth the time investment, and credit to the Globe for for doing that.
And Nestor, tell a little bit about how you approached it with, it is such a complex story with many moving parts, and I'm interested so much in the research that you did with the scientists who you found on the Cape. Of course, we have Woods Hole right there, and Manomet, but.
Yeah, well, one of the other things we wrestled with is that narrative storytelling of the kind that Steve is one of the best in the world at working on, and that I enjoy writing and have done well with Steve in the past, is that it is sometimes not the best way to communicate scientific information, right? A good story follows the path of what happens regardless of what it is emblematic of. So to approach this, we had to do something a little different, which is I had to really sort of immerse myself in the science, and that's reflected through the voices of a couple of scientists in the story, but many, many more who were incredibly patient and generous with their time, with a reporter who was coming in having only really read and covered perfunctory sort of climate stories in the past. And so once we had that foundation of information and I felt like I had a good handle on the material and people were getting sick of taking my calls for clarification, that's when I was able to go out and sort of find the stories that truly reflected the science on the ground, whether that's Wimbrel, who makes his way around the world, or John Oman, whose story turned out to be a remarkable sort of reflection of the erosion that's happening on the Outer Cape.
John, I thought we might just ask you if this experience has helped answer the question that we all have when it comes to taking a photograph about climate change. So for decades, it seems that that polar bear sitting on that melting iceberg was the image that we saw. And of course, the social scientists will say that that then allowed us to think, well, this is far away, it's happening to a bear, and it's not something I need to worry about right now. It might be interesting, I might like the bear, but so your photographs, and I hope all of you have been online to see this content, is just an outstanding showcase. And I've just wondered, I know you're going to talk more about it, but to answer that question, how do you take a picture of climate change?
It's not easy, and it's probably the most difficult assignment I ever did in my career for the Globe, especially to illustrate the beautiful work that Nestor did. But I think I summed up climate change on Cape Cod in one photo, believe it or not, and it's the photograph of the little girl wearing the white hat sitting on the beach. And it's Nauset Beach, and it was a beautiful day, which started out, beautiful as Cape Cod weather is, and then an hour later, the storm started brewing off the ocean. But she just calmly sat there and was playing with her bucket of sand. And I felt his looking at the present and his looking at the future in the same photograph. The threat of climate change just kind of looming in the distance, and this girl who just doesn't seem to care the least. She just wants to have fun. And I think, Nestor described going over the bridge, the Sagamore Bridge, is like you leave your worries behind, welcome to Cape Cod, and I think of all the people I talked to, people just wanted to have fun. People wanted to go to the Cape and they didn't want to care about climate change in a way. So that was hard for me to illustrate when people weren't really consumed by it at that point.
Thank you. Will we see that photograph in a few minutes?
Yes, that will be
Yay.
on the screen.
Okay, great. We have 30 seconds left, unbelievably. We could go on for hours here, but we have a packed evening. So I just wanted Steve to just give us a picture of what the audience response has been and where we're going to go from here.
Brian gave us a pretty good taste. I think we were all worried after the kind of investment that we made about how well it would actually do. But as Brian said, it became one of the best read stories of the year. I think in the 5 days of its release, we had 100,000 readers, which is very large for an online audience. And as Brian pointed out, a very long engaged time. It's continued since its release to get very good traffic. We've kept it on the homepage, and It feels like a success to me in that sense, because what I hope people will take away from it is some motivation then to act.
That'll be the next step. Okay, well, I think we're right out of time. So thank you all.
So, John, perhaps we can start with you. As someone from the outside looking at this, one of my students who is not from around here, and I had to explain to students what Cape Cod was and what a clam shack is, and she said, "Well, why do they let people keep building there? Why are they're going to rebuild there? That's crazy." So, of course, that's easy to say from the outside, but to someone who literally lives and works there, what's the conversation like down there about the decision to rebuild versus relocation, stand and defend, this whole debate, which I'm sure is going on?
Well, thank you. The replacement issue is a done deal in my mind. There's never going to be another Williams on Nassau Beach, because the beach is not going to be there in the next few years. It's going to erode at a dramatic pace. But I do get that question all the time, is when are you going to rebuild Williams? We miss the place. They want the history to repeat itself, and it's just never going to be able to do that. Cape Cod is changing, as I said in this film, forever, and we better get used to it.
So, thanks for being succinct. I appreciate that. It's unusual, as I'm used to a bunch of academics who you ask them for 2 minutes and you have to pull the chain to get on to the next person. So, on the relocation versus stand and defend, this whole discussion, Julian, perhaps you could, from your perspective in state government and also a resident of the Cape.
Well, I'm a politician, so I'm sure I'll eat up John's time. First of all, there's a lot of Cape Codders in the audience, and it's so nice to see you. And also to see a piece that really reflects the community that I live in and I grew up in. I'm a native Cape Codder. I grew up in Truro. I remember when Boston Beach first broke. I think it was a nor'easter in 91 or 92. But to see a piece that really captures Cape Codders. A lot of folks come to Cape Cod, but to hear from Cape Cod, I just really love that in the piece, and to see folks like Mark Adams, who is a friend of mine. I go to the beach with him. I see him at the gay bars in P-Town. All the people who are in this piece, it's really wonderful. Really for us, where we are now, we're having to make decisions in the 15 towns on Cape Cod, the 6 towns on Martha's Vineyard, on Nantucket. We're having to make decisions that we thought we'd have to make in 25, 50, 100 years. We're having to make those decisions in the next 5 to 10 years. Anyone who truly lives and understands where we live, there's no kind of getting ahead of the tide, right? You have to retreat. And what's really the challenge is you've got a lot of small communities. We've got a heavy tradition of local control here in Massachusetts. And so how do we go about making really tough decisions about saying, all right, maybe it's worth shoring up this coastal road, but we can't have that one there. Those are really tough, decisions to have and to make, and we're going to need a lot of help to do that.
Great. Linda, any thoughts on the relocation challenge?
Well, I do think it is a challenge, and I think that, as people, we're used to thinking that the world will be static. There's actually been some social science done that shows that most people envision the world the way it was when they were 14, 15 or 16. Seriously. And I look back and I think, yeah, that's how I think of the world too. But when I look at it now, I realize that, it is dramatically different. It has changed in a lot of ways. And so I think as a society, we have to get more comfortable with the idea that the world is changing around us and we can't remain static. Because if we remain static, basically we're going to go underwater. So we can have the same kinds of experiences on the Cape. We can have clam shacks. We just can't have Liam's at that spot on the Cape forever, because that spot on the Cape isn't going to be there forever. So I think that's a discussion that as a society we have to have, that you can have the thought, you can have the experience. It doesn't have to be a physically stuck in one location kind of place. And I think, it's really helpful to also think that in the film they talked about how salt marshes were critical to the birds and to sustaining fish, and those salt marshes also need somewhere to go. And as long as we're building seawalls that try to hold things flat, then those marshes aren't going to have anywhere to go either. So we need to give the room to the world to move around, the natural system to move around, and we have to give society some way to have a conversation about how you can have the experience, but it won't be the exact same physical location.
Linda, I love that you talked about how it's always changing on Cape Cod. That's actually one of the things I love about being a Cape Codder and making a life there. And it's very humbling, right, that the beach looks different every summer, right? I mean, there's the world you're around, you kind of know you can't really control it. And I think a lot of Cape Codders, if you've watched it, you've seen that. And so how do you reconcile that desire for our 14-year-old minds? But I find as someone who lives on Cape Cod, I've just sort of grown up with this and watched it, and so you've got to accept the fact that Boston Beach is not what Boston Beach was when I was a kid, and it's not going to be what it is today in 10 or 20 years. And there's a humility in that.
Well, on the political process, so that's a good segue, and I'll start with you, Julian. Then, John, I wanted to ask you about sort of on the ground local politics. So, from a state government perspective, what can we really expect the Commonwealth to do? What role does the Commonwealth have in driving the type of change that you two just described, really all three of you just described, has to happen to make sure that the type of development occurs fast enough? And then, and what is the relationship between the state and these very local levels who make on-the-ground decisions?
So we've broadly been a leader in climate disruption, but it's just coming so much more faster than we even expected. You look at the Global Warming Solutions Act from 2008, which was considered a landmark. Well, it's woefully out of date. We need to look at a state level. We need to look at both adaptation and mitigation. That starts with support for our communities. And there's actually been a number of proposals put out there. So Governor Baker put out a proposal around $1 billion, $100 million every year for the next 10 years that he uses on a sort of a doubling of the deeds excise tax. The House this summer passed an initiative, also $1 billion, $100 million over 10 years. They get at that through borrowing funds. The Senate, we're currently looking at legislation. I think we've got such a big problem. We don't need a bill. We need $2 billion, right? We need $200 million to our communities, coming to provide resources around how do you plan for this. I think the other piece that's really important, we passed in 2018 a pretty substantial environmental bond bill. It's a $2.4 billion bond. A bond bill basically means we have authorization to borrow for these projects. This was passed by the legislature. It was signed by the governor. We need to get those dollars released today, right? We can't be waiting for, even if it's until, May, June, July of this summer when we kind of come with some reconciliation with legislation. So I think it's really important, there are tools in the toolbox today. We need to get those dollars released. We need to have the state step up further, and we need to be really honest about the cost, and we need to come up with a revenue stream to fund it. Yes, we can do some borrowing, but I think it's really important that we have real dollars that are actually coming in that are going to need to really finance the work that needs to be done.
John,
the money
let's
daunting.
get local.
Yeah, the money is daunting. Julie and I work together. We're very local with the county, and we work with the state as best as we can. But one of the things I wish the state would do, the sea level is rising. They're going to say, for you young people out there, by the time you're 50, there'll be a 2-foot sea rise, which may not sound like much to you, but it's going to inundate a lot of Cape Cod, and take roads, and they're going to be inundated. They're not going to be there, just like that video that you saw. There's going to be more roads like that, and we have to face that daunting monetary challenge. One of the things that I wish the state would do is that the local towns, Truro being the smallest, Ennis being in the middle, we would love to strengthen our building codes so that people could only build in certain places and would have to build to higher standards for hurricanes, for water. But the state has a state building code that is solid stone, and we cannot supersede it to make our towns safer and more viable going into the future. I think I would love to have people start to lobby the state to change those building structures and let us have a little bit of a home rule so that we can fit the future into our plans on our own accord.
Linda, yeah.
You bring up a really interesting point. In Massachusetts, for many kinds of rules and regulations, towns are allowed to have rules that are stronger than. They can't be weaker than the state regulations. But if you're as a town, you vote in your town meeting, you can have rules that are stronger than the state. The building code is one of the areas where that's not true. And so I think that's one place where the state could make some progress. I also think that, and these plans have been proposed before, that, obviously, it's a shock when your house blows away, and then what do, right? And your immediate reaction, like after a hurricane or after a fire or after anything, is like, build it back, right the way it was, right where you were. There have been proposals in the past that say, okay, you get to do that maybe 1 or 2 times, but not 10 times. That we should be learning from the fact. We know, for instance, that most of the flood insurance goes to pay for the same 5% of buildings over and over and over again, right? So clearly those are places we shouldn't be building. So we could enact some legislation, which would have to happen at the state level, that puts a limit on the number of times you should be able to rebuild in the same place after storm damage. It gives you as a homeowner a chance to think about what you want to do. And I do think this issue of how do you balance the broader societal needs versus individual property owners is something we have to have a dialogue at and around with these issues. Because you might be able to protect your house by building a seawall, a 10-foot tall, 500-foot long seawall, but you build that seawall and you're starving the houses on either side of you of the sand that they need to stay in place, or the beach to be able to move around. And so that sort of private versus society balance is something we need to have more dialogues about. So yes, we need a lot of money, but I think we also need to have conversations.
So John and Julian, there must be pockets of resistance. I mean, I'm sure the response to this must be uneven. Well, maybe it's not, but across towns and across. So how do you, where there is resistance to change, people who want to stand and defend, what's the plan? What works and what doesn't work to get change happening?
I can tell you that from my point of view, money rules. There are places on the Cape that will do exactly what you said. They will build a revetment wall that's 10 feet tall and 500 feet long, but the next person down that can't afford that wall loses their home on a slow and steady basis. So I think we have to counteract the fact that money rules, and you have to do a much more general benefit to society, and those are regulations that have to come.
No, I mean, climate disruption, like almost anything, right? Who are the haves and who are the have-nots are really a big piece of this, right? So if you look at, if you talk to my constituents, voting constituents, people who make their lives on Cape Cod and the islands, they know this. They've been watching this their entire lives. Some folks, are in pretty vulnerable places, but, most local folks are living inland, right? Because that's where the more affordable housing is. In the old days, you wouldn't build a house on a bluff or overlooking the ocean because it was a very sort of dangerous place to be, right? So our existing kind of infrastructure, it's all of this second, third, fourth home ownership. That really, I think, is part of this attitude that, I have mine and I'm going to build that seawall and not think about, the other repercussions. We're also really fortunate here. If we didn't have the Cape Cod National Seashore, we would be in a much trickier situation, right? The Cape Cod National Seashore's job, you heard from Mark Adams, but their job is to basically steward and preserve the natural rhythms and cycles and environment here. So basically, almost the entire barrier beach of Cape Cod, from Chatham to P-Town, maybe there's 2 dozen homes, 3 dozen homes there. So we're fortunate in that way, but I really see, particularly when you look at all issues on Cape Cod, whether it's on climate disruption, who's vulnerable to that, also around housing, right? This is a place that has become profoundly unaffordable because we just have this second, third homeowner market. Aside from this sort of broader existential crisis, right, we're dealing with the fact that folks just can't afford to live there. So I think the state does need to step in, right? That's kind of our job, and our role is to be an arbiter. And I think we need to do that, but that's very difficult, particularly in a pretty litigious society where, folks can just sort of lawyer up and, milk the town and push the towns and fight the towns and the local control. And that's a really big challenge. We already see that. We're going to continue to see that. I don't know how you solve it, but it's money really talks.
Thanks. So a couple minutes left, and I wanted to end with a question, starting with you, Linda, as a scientist on the panel, and following up on Sarah Finney-Robinson's discussion about the Project 51 project here at BU about climate communication. How do we improve communication of science and dialogue? So as a scientist, Linda, who's been working in this area for a long time, how can we, what are the attributes of good communication which get science in the hands of people, whether it's the private sector, policymakers, whomever it might be, to make behavioral technologies policy line up with what the science tells us?
This is not a paid advertisement. The Globe did a fantastic job because they threaded the needle exactly right. You have to give people the information, but you have to also make it accessible so that you get and understand how critical and how near-term and how important this is, but you don't scare people to death that they just say, I'm just going to put my head in the sand, as long as the sand is still there, and not do anything. It's something that, as a scientist, I have long struggled with. I think, and I do presentations, and I think sometimes I just scare my audience to death, and they think I can't do anything. In an odd way, Massachusetts and Cape Cod is in a unique position to set an example for other parts of the United States and how to do things, because this combination that we have of local control and a strong state government, but we're in a place where the sea level is rising faster than almost anywhere else in the United States, and the temperatures in the coast are rising faster than anywhere else in the United States. So we're anywhere else in the world. So we're, we're on the cutting edge. We're on the front line here of climate change, and we have opportunities to really change how people react to that. But again, it does come down to that communication. And one of the things that we're doing where I work at the Woods Hole Research Center is we're trying to communicate both with the public, but also with the people who control the money, right? So we heard twice, money talks. And what we're trying to do is communicate with big investment firms and say, you need to put climate change into your thinking about what your investment portfolio is. Stop bankrolling those people who are building 20-story casinos on the edge of the beach in Virginia. Stop putting your money into things where the risk to climate vulnerability is really high. So we're trying to get those kinds of industries to change how they're allocating their money. And I think we need communication on a lot of different levels. We need the public to understand, we need them to think about it, but we also need businesses to understand that in order to preserve their way of life as a business, they have to take into account climate risk. And that's an area where we're seeing really audiences that are willing to listen because they now firmly believe climate change is real.
I'm going to take a few in a lightning round so that we can get more answered. So, sir, I saw you first. Please identify yourself and tell me your question, and we'll take a few, and then we'll answer them after I take a few.
My name's Peter Wallace. I'm lucky enough to have a cottage in Brewster. I'm fired up that Senator Sarah's fired up to address this issue. I'm on a stretch of beach, a quarter mile. Everybody has a wall. 3 homeowners cannot increase the size of their wall. It makes no sense whatsoever. I don't want state money. I just want to be able to increase the size of the wall, make it a little bit more sturdy. So I'm interested, perhaps the senator can guide me.
About
About changing a law so I can
Okay.
increase the
Okay, good, all
sturdiness
right.
of my wall.
All right, that's very specific. I feel like we should have this should be like a constituent meeting. You need to come, yeah, office hours. All right, sir, please tell us your name and your question quickly.
My name is Stephen Tom, and I'm here representing several organizations. First, the Faith Communities Environmental Network, also the Blue Economy Foundation on the Cape, and the Cape Cod Technology Council. And it crossed my mind as you were all speaking, is there any scientific work being done to explore how all of that destructive ocean energy might be somehow harnessed to rebuild the Cape? We've spent a lot of time talking about how climate change and sea level rise is going to essentially destroy a lot of what is already there. We keep calling it change. Can any of that change be positive by putting money and construction in the right places? We know, for instance, that the canal jetty did some rerouting of water flows that have pulled sand away. What if you reverse that and push sand back onto the beach?
Okay, thank you. And we'll take a third question just now before we start answers.
My name is Michelle, and I'm privileged to be a long-term summer resident and hopefully future long year-round resident of the Cape, particularly in West Yarmouth. I am particularly concerned about Nantucket Sound and the south-facing beaches, places that I've watched change dramatically over the years. I've seen the temperatures rise, felt the temperatures rise in the oceans. And I missed the first half hour, so I apologize if this has been covered, but I'd love to hear your comments about changes, particularly on the Sound. And also, if there are places on the Cape where you've seen beaches getting built up, because I know sometimes there's that effect as well.
Okay,
So,
thank you. All right, so the first question is clearly for Senator Serra. So we'll give that one to you about changing laws to build walls and otherwise protect your property.
Sure. So, I mean, on a specific project, I'd actually go talk to the town about that and Mass DEP and others that have to approve it. But I think more broadly, right, we actually have to look at this a little more holistically. And, I worry that a lot of our policy has been, all right, this house or this neighborhood, and we need to look more holistically. And we're frankly going to have a process where ultimately we're going to have a conversation about saying, all right, you can build a, I think Linda was talking about this. Well, you can build the wall again, but in, the next nor'easter we get in 5 years, and that's a process that the towns just are really not equipped to have, and so I'd like to have that. On the beaches question, there's actually parts of Provincetown actually is accreting. So if you go to Race Point Beach, accretion means it's more sand is coming there. It's kind of part of the natural sort of sand cycle. If you want, I can connect you with Mark Adams, and I'll tell you everything you can know. Of course, there are concerns on the Sound. I think the most dramatic piece is, you see particularly that outer beach. I didn't know this in the article, and this was fascinating, that actually because the sea level's rising over Georges Bank is this kind of elevated part in the Atlantic Ocean, it's actually meaning that more wave energy is actually hitting the Cape more than we've ever had, right? So there's a whole host of pieces there. Certainly the Sound's a part of that too. I think from a visual perspective, and the biggest changes we're seeing are on the Outer Cape, but it's across the region, and frankly, it's here.
Linda, I'd like to direct the second question to you about could there be any way that the ocean could be harnessed to rebuild the Cape and using climate change in a positive way? Is that possible?
I think the ocean already does that. And I think we have to be careful. The Cape has existed for a very long time. The reason we think of the Cape as being, quote, destroyed by climate change is because the Cape is being reshaped against things we're trying to make stay still, right? So the oceans already let the Cape rebuild. They just build that beach over there, and you want it here.
Does anyone on the panel have anything to add about Nantucket Sound and the south-facing beaches?
Yes, and in general terms, the warmer the water, the less sea life you'll have, as we know it on the Cape. So West Yarmouth is going through what is it? Which bay? Which way are we talking about? It has a very warm climate now, and it's changing the structure. Not so much the ocean front, the sands, but the water itself is changing dramatically. There is now new reports off of Sandwich, which is the other side, that there are dead zones where lobsters are washing up dead now. And these zones are increasing, and no one knows what happened, but it really is climate change, and it's the warming of the waters, and sea life can't adjust to it fast enough. So I wish I had good news about West Yarmouth, but I think that we're we have a long-term problem that we have to solve, and I'm not sure the answer.
All right, and there might be some students here from the BU School of Communications, so you should feel also welcome to ask a question of Nestor about the process of doing this journalism. So we're going to take a couple questions. I'm going to go to the student first, and then to you, sir. Go ahead.
On that note, that was sort of where I was directing my questions. I'm
How to identify yourself?
yeah. So my name's Damon Musso. I'm a senior studying public relations at the College of Communications here at Boston University. And I also work with the 51% Project with Sarah Robinson. And, you know, our goal is to sort of send messages to young people, millennials and Gen Z, around climate change. And so to Dr. Deegan, your point about how do you make a message that's not overly terrifying, but can galvanize, and also with this great reporting that the Globe has been doing, if you have tips for maybe younger storytellers, how to produce these messages that can be insightful and also quick and to the point, but impactful.
Thank you, sir.
Hi, my name is Russ Donnelly. My connection to the Cape began 65 years ago when my mother's doctor decided that he could save the baby as well as my mother. I was born at Cape Cod Hospital. I've actually covered it for the emergency room sometimes. My question is for the senator. If Cape Cod is at risk so much, in addition to many other places in Massachusetts, why is Massachusetts lagging California? In terms of California, as of 2020, will require every new house to have solar on top of it. It's actually more financially remunerative to put solar on your house in Massachusetts than it is in California. Also, San Jose recently mandated that they will not allow new houses to have hookups with natural gas. That should be a no-brainer for every new house on Cape Cod. Also, California certainly leads Massachusetts in the adoption of electric vehicles. There should be a tax at the bridge for every ice-mobile that goes over the bridge. Electric vehicles should drive free, and we need to do something about the ferries, too.
Sounds like you have someone trying out to be on your advisory committee here. Maybe he wants a staff position here on climate change. All right, I'm going to ask, I'm going to take one more because we're doing rounds of three, and I need to ask everyone, please keep your questions short because we're almost out of time and we want to give everyone a chance to ask a quick question and not make a statement.
My name is Shanshan He. I'm a senior at School of Hotel Administration, and I'm writing an article about hospitality and how to combat climate change. And I just want to ask, because the Cape is very connected with tourism and hospitality, and what can we do to combat climate change as an industry, and what can students do as recent graduates and new people in the industry? What can they do to combat climate change? Not just talking about saving the towels or toilet papers.
Okay, thank you. Nestor, I think the first question goes to you about how to communicate in a way that's not overly terrifying, but can galvanize action. And, we had Linda praising what you did, saying that it was extremely effective. So what's your secret sauce, and how can other people do the same?
Well, I don't know if I have secret sauce, but it's a real challenge with this, and it was something we thought a lot about. I was talking with Jeff Donnelly, who's in the story, who's a scientist at HUI, another organization in Woods Hole, and he found much the same, right? That when he's out talking to people about, he studies storms, and when he's out talking to people about storms that he's modeled and how bad they would be, they sort of wave him off, like, oh, what does that mean, modeled? You just made that up. So what he did instead was to focus on storms that have actually happened in the past, whether that's Hurricane Bob or the storm in 1938, and map those onto today. What would that storm look like if it hit today? It's not hypothetical. It's a real storm that happened. And sort of that writ large was our strategy for this whole piece, which is what can you really lay eyes on already right now? And that, I think, connects with folks in a way that sometimes the true but troubling predictions for the future don't. So that was one of the things that I think really worked for us on this project, was to really focus on what you can lay eyes on. And I'm going to let Julian handle most of that other question, but I will say that it's something we thought a lot about and addressed a little bit in the story, which is that the way most of us who don't live and work on the Cape experience the Cape is to load a bunch of junk in our cars and drive down there, right? I mean, even now. And I was talking with George Woodwell, who founded Woods Hole Research Center, where Linda works, and he, one of the things he said is most critical is to electrify the transportation grid. In Massachusetts, the majority of our carbon emissions are transportation related, and we've got an awful long way to go before that happens. You don't even really see too many electric cars yet, even as we talk about expanding the bridges to the Cape, which needs to happen, but is really a sort of tough to reconcile.
Cutler, you wanted to jump in?
On the communication side, so I've been just speaking to a student here who I think I've actually may have had in class. So I've been teaching in the energy and climate sciences for 30 years. And one of the biggest challenges is not to leave students just super depressed when they leave the classroom. And there's an amazing story to tell here as well about opportunity. Because if you think about, for every coal mine job lost, every restaurant that falls in the sea, there's a whole slew of new types of occupations and mindsets and skills that are needed. The solar energy industry is the fastest growing employer in the United States. We need people who sell insurance, who understand these risks. We have to have new models of finance to finance all these energy efficiency improvements. So there's a whole slew of opportunities out there, and we're training students here at BU and a lot of other places. And these students who leave with this skill and this knowledge, they're getting jobs like that. And so there's a whole wave of opportunity here for students to find not only a career, but a calling in life in one fell swoop.
Great. Linda, were you wanting to address the question about why Massachusetts is apparently lagging California, although I'll let you fact check that. I don't know if that's correct or not.
Everyone lags California. The whole world lags California,
okay.
So it's not a bad place to be.
Would either of you like to jump in on that? Curtis or Linda?
Yes, we're behind California in a lot of ways, but I think Massachusetts is ahead of a lot of other states. So, you know, it's not a race. We all got to get there, and we all have to get there sooner rather than later.
See, I think the race piece is the important, actually. And I really worry that Massachusetts, we've sort of lost our edge in being in the ambitious business, in the vision business, when it comes to public policy. We've really been playing it safe the last 5, 6 or so years. And I worry really about, you know, no, I mean, and seriously, that we've got a major problem. And that we are lagging other states. When I used to work as a legislative aide at the Department of Public Health in Massachusetts, we would always sell, you know how we would sell initiatives to our lawmakers? We'd say, well, you know, Massachusetts would be the first in the country, the first in the nation. That's actually very effective on Beacon Hill. We're a small state with big egos, fragile egos. No, but this is important, and we're really lagging. And so, you know, I'm excited to take up this legislation. I don't know what the gentleman who asked that question was, but, you know, I'm excited to really take up legislation. My office, we're looking at a whole host of things around, you know what a big challenge is? We've got a lot of historic district commissions in Massachusetts, and that's a real big barrier to solar installation. So I've got a bill working on that. You know, I hope we look really seriously at congestion pricing, and tolling should be an option across the Commonwealth, right? But I worry that our vision's gotten a little limited. And even if you look at the proposal that was put out by the governor and the proposal that was passed the House, there's a lot of really good things in there, and I don't want to discount those, but I fear that those don't meet the moment. And I think it is important to say, hey, California's doing this, New York's doing this, where are you, Massachusetts? Because that's actually something that's been effective in moving public policy here in the state. Just look at healthcare.
The last question was about hospitality industry, and I feel like, John, you could take a brief stab at that. You showed us you can answer questions very briefly at the top.
What was the question?
It was the question that the young woman here had about, how climate affects the hospitality industry and what should students be doing who want to work in hospitality to raise awareness of climate change and make a difference.
Well, there's so many ways to answer that question. I noticed, we live on Cape Cod. Do you know that you can't effectively fish for cod on Cape Cod any longer? My fish comes from Norway or Russia. It doesn't come from Cape Cod. So climate change affects the way you can deliver food. The oyster industry is one of the rare examples now that Cape Cod used to be a farming community, and we replaced all those farms with houses, at a half acre or a third acre at a time. But the oyster industry is a tremendous, from Provincetown to Dennis, all the way to Chatham and on the inside. There's oyster farms, there's other farms where they float, farming seafood and scallops. They float them, and they meet tremendous resistance from wealthy families. I can't drive my yacht there because your stupid oyster farm is in my way. So those are the kind of things that in the hospitality industry, I specifically talk about the food end of it, saying you have to get involved, show up, and talk about how sustainability is much more important than wealth for the future of your generation.
I would say just briefly, that was a great point. On hospitality administration, you can demand from your faculty and your administrators that they teach that they are teaching people who work in this industry how to be sustainable. It is a wildly unsustainable industry, wildly unsustainable.
All the hospitality in general.
The hospitality industry in general, the procurement of food, water, clothing, travel. And so there are a few hospitality schools around the country who are actually tackling this in a major way. And it's a tough sell because part of the unsustainability is that people travel a lot, but there are ways to do it, and there are leaders in the field. So demand from your faculty curricula that help you learn what it means to be a sustainable in the sustainable hospitality industry.
All right, we are running over time, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to just take 3 last questions and make it a lightning round, sir.
Hi, my name is Steve Hassel. I was educated as a civil and environmental engineer here in Boston, and I really compliment the panel tonight. A lot of good information and great for the people from the Cape. I am not from the Cape, but I love it. And I would just say that, geologically, the Cape was formed as a glacial moraine 14,000 years ago as the ice sheets retreated. So it was given to us by global warming in an ancient way. And I'm not denying that global warming today is bothering us. I do go back to Buckminster Fuller and the, spaceship Earth and Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth that's only accelerating. It's not only water erosion that's hurting the Cape, it's wind. And I know you know that. If you go back 150 years when Henry Thoreau wrote his book on Cape Cod, he talked about the erosion on the windward side, deposits on the leeward side. It's something that's nature, and it's been happening a long time, although it's accelerating. I think all the good things we're trying to do globally are great, but they're going to take a long time. The Cape needs a very big, strong Band-Aid if you're going to stop what's happening. And as you said, beaches are moving, and things that we want to stay where they are moving. So it's going to take a lot of money and a big Band-Aid to work that through, and some highly active people, along with the global environmental sustainability. Not a question, I guess, but
Okay.
what is that Band-Aid?
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Jessica Calarasi. I'm a writer here at BU, and thank you all for being here tonight and for your marvelous piece of journalism. I'm actually from Long Island, and I've never been to the Cape, which is outrageous to say here. But we've talked about the seawalls that people are building, and my guess as someone who's never been there is that not everybody can afford that, and not everyone can afford those changes. So I was curious what is being done to address those inequalities that climate will only exacerbate. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I'm a student at BU, and I'd like to direct my question to Nestor Ramos, if possible. It's about journalism mainly. So I wanted to know, there's been constant coverage of climate change, like a lot more constant coverage just within the last year. So I wanted to know how you believe that has impacted America's discussion on climate change, and then as a communicator to the public, if you believe that combating climate change is possible. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you. So the first question from the first Jessica is about affordability of mitigation. So who can tackle for us the question on inequities in the system where you have some people who can afford to put up seawalls and other people who can't? And how do you address that? You sort of addressed that a bit, Senator Sarah, about talking about, towns getting sued from here to kingdom come when some people, just say, I'm going to keep building on that one bluff.
Yeah.
But
I'm going to hand this over in just a second, but one of the things that I found as having only sort of visited the Cape occasionally before this was one of the things that's most sort of charming and wonderful about the Cape is that it's not just sort of a rich person's playground, right? It's diverse in a lot of ways, and especially economically. And I think what Jessica was asking about is really has a potential to sort of hasten the gentrification of the Cape, which would be a real shame. That would be a big loss to the character of the place.
So I've never been to coastal Long Island. I just want to confess that. And I have a lot of friends who come to Fire Island. And I'm like, no, I have, hometown fidelity. So the adaptation that I'm actually really focused on are not necessarily, folks who have homes on the coast. Those are going to be, adjudicated in certain ways. You're fighting an uphill battle, and you're not going to win. But really, it's about, all right, the infrastructure in our communities, right? So if you go to Martha's Vineyard, Oak Bluffs, Vineyard Haven, and Edgartown, the major roads that connect them all run along the shoreline, which is beautiful, except it becomes, quite risky when you've got a major coastal storm and it's a question whether or not, can I even get someone to the hospital? So I think a lot of our focus needs to be actually on, the infrastructure. Or you look at a place like Provincetown, which is, the best preserved, 19th century fishing village. Commercial Street's essentially going to be underwater, right? How do we sort of plan for that? What's increasingly happening is that homes are being put up on stilts. It looks more like the Outer Banks. But I think that's sort of the adaptation, in the midterm we need to look at. Fortunately, from a local's perspective, most of us don't have, unless those of us who are really lucky to, our families kind of got in early or something, most of us aren't living, directly on the ocean side, right? Maybe you got a little peek of a view. So, from the actual lived infrastructure, most of the folks, especially lower income folks and working class folks, aren't sort of on the bluff. Provincetown, Nantucket, there's some big exceptions there, but I'm really focused, especially the infrastructure piece, because that's going to be a really big challenge. If you can't get to the hospital, you can't get to work, particularly in these weather events. We just had a storm the other day that knocked out power to I think 17,000 homes just on Cape Cod, and it took 4 or 5 days for it to get. Did you have power?
I lost power Wednesday night at 12:30, got it back Saturday at 3.
The power came back on faster when we had tornadoes. But, so this is kind of what we've got to prepare for.
The point you made, actually, Senator, about the Outer Banks is an interesting one because it made me think about how in North Carolina, it's, yes, you have rich people living right along the coast, but people forget about the climate change impact on the inner communities who are working people who are serving those coastal communities. So the impact goes further and further back. Cape Cod is unique in that it's very mixed sort of throughout, or maybe more unique than North Carolina, but that's a really good point. Did somebody else want to add something to that?
On the equity front, I think both on the impacts of climate change and heat waves, air quality, flooding, sea level rise, and also on the cost of mitigation. How do we replace our fossil fuel system with clean energy? The poor and people of color disproportionately are impacted in every country on the planet. And you can see it right here in Boston, a majority-minority city, where now we're trying to become a carbon neutral city. So by 2050, there'll be no fossil fuels in Boston. How do you do that when 15% of the households spend more than a 25% of their monthly income on fuel and electricity? And those people are predominantly people of color. These are the types of questions, like the one you raised about North Carolina. If you are not baking equity at the very outset of your discussion, and it's interesting that we haven't talked about it once, I think, until the last part of the show. If you're not baking it into the discussion from the start, you're ignoring it. And by definition, it's going to get worse.
Well, I should say that Eric from Boston Latin did actually raise that. I think he said about equity and the importance of, that we need to look at it, how it's affecting lower socioeconomic groups. So people are thinking about it, at least the next generation is. The last question from Jessica, number 2, is a perfect place for us to wrap this up, I think, because we began with journalism. From that, the community outreach, we're bringing it back to journalism. So the question was really about, well, you take it away, communicating all of this better.
Yeah, part of the question was whether this can be effective, and I think we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years that it can, right? I mean, 5 or 10 years ago, if the Globe undertook this project, we wouldn't have been able to say, no, we're not going to engage in a debate about whether climate change is real. It would have had to have been part of the story. Now, something like 60-70% of the people in America are on the same page. They believe that this is something critically important. They put it maybe in their top 10 or so list of important issues, which they didn't before. That's a testament to the communication that scientists like Linda and the media have done. As to whether or not it's sort of hopeful going forward, I would say that some of the folks we had up earlier are a pretty good indication that it is, whether it's Nico, who's working on something down in the Cape, or the guys from Boston Latin. It's kind of depressing that we've offloaded these problems onto 16, 17, 18-year-olds, right? But we have, and thankfully they're stepping up to take the reins. So that's what gives me hope.
Thank you. Did you want to add something, Linda, quickly?
We told them to show up at their select board meeting. Now we're telling you. All you gray-haired people out there, if you haven't been to your select board meeting and stomped your foot about climate change, get up and go.